I were able to time travel to any point in history, one of the places that would easily make my top 10 would be the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. It was filled with invention, innovation, a sense of optimism for the future, and shared the discoveries of some of the greatest minds in the Western world. But was it really as great as history makes it out to be? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Historidame, and today, we're learning all about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The Chicago World's Fair would open to the public on May 5, 1893, and during its 6 months of operation, it would see around 27 million visitors walk through its gates. The fair would cover 2.8 square kilometers of land, and feature around 200 buildings, many following neoclassical architecture styles, focusing on elegance and symmetry, each painted bright white. The fair would be known as the Columbian Exposition, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of terrible person Christopher Columbus and his unfortunate arrival in the New World. It would also mark a new point in the city of Chicago's history. After being almost entirely burned to the ground in the Great Fire 22 years before, the 1893 Exposition gave Chicago an opportunity to show what the city was capable of and cement its reputation as a world-class destination. The fair's exhibits would be a testament to the world's technological advancements, and would feature many everyday items that we still use in our lives today, some for the very first time. Notable historical figures who could be found in attendance included people like Harry Houdini, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Henry Ford, Helen Keller, and Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, whose murder would later be the catalyst for World War I. "46 different countries had their own pavilions at the fair, as well as several US states, including California, Colorado, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, and many more. These cultural pavilions contained attractions that would show fairgoers the best that these places had to offer, displaying everything from art to agriculture. There were also 14 industry buildings that showcased the latest inventions across their respective fields. Some highlights include a 3,000-foot aquarium in the Fisheries Building, the first telegraph message ever sent in the Electricity Building, a Japanese garden in the Horticultural Building, and a 22,000-pound piece of cheese, known as the Mammoth Cheese, which was displayed in the Agricultural Building on behalf of Canada. I can only be proud of my country and their giant cheese. There was also the Women's Building, which was the only one of the bunch to be entirely designed, decorated, and run by women. This featured exhibits displaying women's accomplishments from around the world, including things like art, literature, and advancements in science. For those looking for something that skewed towards a younger audience, there was also a children's building, where kids could enjoy murals depicting scenes from popular fairy tales, or see the latest advancements in toy making. Little girls were also encouraged to check out the kitchen garden, where they could learn how to become good housewives, and do fun activities like making beds, sweeping floors, and pretending that they didn't have opinions. Young boys, on the other hand, were sent to the Swedish workshop, where they could practice using tools and learn wood carving. But among all of these pavilion buildings, I noticed a certain trend that tends to arise numerous times, that being weird sculptures. Yes, the Victorians loved a good thing made out of another thing. There were sculptures made of chocolate, including a 7.5-foot tall recreation of Christopher Columbus, and replicas of classic statues. The Mining Building had a mini Statue of Liberty made out of salt, and on behalf of California, there was a 35-foot tall tower made of oranges. This tower contained 14,000 of the fruit, and had to be entirely replaced every 3 to 4 weeks to prevent it from spoiling. Even more impressive was the Edison Tower in the Electric Building, a structure that was covered in thousands of twinkling lights, showcasing just one of the electric wonders that the fair would be known for. There was also apparently a map of the United States made out of pickles, but unfortunately I couldn't find a photo. Now, despite the fact that the Columbian Exposition was advertised as a World's Fair, this did not mean that it was an accurate representation of the world. As mentioned, it only featured 46 countries, and heavily favored those who were white and Western. Even worse, African Americans and other people of color were barred from sharing their achievements, despite the fact that many of these countries were built on the backs of their labor. In the few instances in which they were included, they were portrayed as less than in every case. The women's building, for example, had 2 small displays that featured work by women of color. One of these was titled Women's Work in Savagery, and included things like weaving and basket making, and were presented as primitive relics from a time long past, despite the fact that they were just created recently. The Midway was a mile-long strip of amusements where the quote-unquote less sophisticated attractions could be found. To the average fairgoer, however, this was the place to be. Many of these attractions would charge an additional fee alongside your entry ticket, and were chosen to appeal to the masses. Here, guests could catch a show by famous escape artist Harry Houdini, or see a menagerie of trained animals performing tricks at Hagenbeck Zoological Arena. Those who were interested in a more thrilling experience might also take a turn on several of the dubiously safe rides, like Thomas Rankin's Snow and Ice Railway, a refrigerated toboggan slide featuring a 25-foot drop, or a hot air balloon, which would take passengers up to 15,000 feet into the air, until one day a strong gust of wind caused it to crash, much to the horror of passengers and onlookers. But by far, the star attraction of the Midway was the Ferris wheel. Built to be a centerpiece of the fairgrounds, and to flex on the Eiffel Tower from the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, this massive 264-foot tall ride was the very first of its kind, and would give guests a stunning view of the surrounding fairgrounds and city of Chicago. Exhibits for countries that were deemed to be too uncivilized for the international pavilions would also find a home at the Midway. Here, they would be lined up in order of what the fair organizers considered most to least evolved. Though people tried to make the best displays of their country that they could, some exhibits were advertised using stereotypes that prioritized both a white and Western perspective, often leaning heavily into Orientalism. But by far, the worst offenders were the human zoos, such as the Dahomean village, where fairgoers could observe the so-called least evolved people in their natural habitat. Needless to say, while the Midway was home to some of the most exciting attractions at the fair, it was also a representation of the worst that it had to offer. The Chicago World's Fair is responsible for introducing a number of everyday items to the public. Many popular food brands would either make their debut or gain a following at the fair. These included favorites like Quaker Oats, Juicy Fruit Gum, Cream of Wheat, Hershey's Chocolate, and the famous breakfast mascot Aunt Jemima. There were also quite a few notable inventions that would make an appearance during the exposition. Josephine Garish Cochran would showcase a new type of machine that she created out of a pure hatred for cleaning up after dinner parties. This dishwasher was a hand-powered contraption that was able to clean your tableware for you. A revolutionary idea. Her invention was so popular amongst those at the fair that she was even able to open up her own factory a few years later. Guests could also place their coins inside a mysterious device that would flatten them into the world's very first elongated pennies. This novel idea would grow in popularity until similar machines could be found in tourist attractions all across the country. But arguably the most impressive thing to be showcased to the public was the widespread use of electricity around the fairgrounds. Though it had been used in a small capacity at World's Fairs in the past, the 1893 fair was the very first of its kind to be lit entirely by electric lighting. At this point in history, the idea of electricity for common use was relatively new. In fact, it was rather feared by the public, until people would witness electric lighting for the very first time in those fairgrounds. We actually have the Chicago World's Fair to thank for changing the public's attitude towards this new technology. Now, I don't think any video about the Chicago World's Fair is complete until we talk about some of the wild events that happened during its run. Not too far away from the fairgrounds, one could find the World's Fair Hotel, which was built under the guise of providing lodging for those visiting Chicago for the fair. Though it did provide cheap accommodation, its true purpose was to give a place in which its owner, H.H. Holmes, could trap his murder victims. Later nicknamed the Murder Hotel, this building allegedly contained various secret passageways, trapdoors, and even gas chambers that allowed Holmes to trap and kill his guests who stayed the night. Though many historians believe that the accounts of the World's Fair Hotel were highly exaggerated by the press, there is evidence that Holmes did kill multiple people, but the total number of his victims is still up for debate. Another notable event is that 2 days before the end of the fair, the mayor of Chicago was assassinated, resulting in the closing ceremonies needing to be cancelled and replaced with a memorial service. There were also 2 fires that broke out on the fairgrounds, the first happening on July 10th, which would end up being the deadliest firefighting incident in Chicago's history at the time. The blaze began in the giant cold storage building, where much of the exposition's food was kept. 15 people would be killed when the building collapsed due to damages from the fire, killing 12 firefighters and 3 civilians who were still inside. The second fire would take place in January after the fair had already closed, destroying most of what was left of the White City, while the people of Chicago could do nothing but watch. Today, only a few of the pavilion halls remain standing, but luckily, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair still lives on in the many surviving photographs, newspaper articles, and first-hand accounts about the event. And in combination, we can still get a little glimpse into what it was like to attend the fair that changed America. Hey everyone, thank you for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.